since then. We have seen record melt of the summer sea ice in the Arctic. What happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic. The more the sea ice melts, it unlocks the ice on land, especially the Greenland ice sheet, which is of direct concern to small islands, especially when it comes to sea level rise. We have seen Hurricane Sandy. How much that will wake up countries like the US and Canada remains to be seen. Frankly, I'm a bit pessimistic. Despite the fury of Hurricane Sandy, even if it was not a climate change event, but made worse by climate change and the warming of the oceans, despite that, despite President Obama saying they need a national conversation on climate change, and I hope it's a very quick conversation that delivers, because one luxury small islands and the least developed countries don't have is time. We don't have the luxury of time. But despite that, the news in the US is already dominated by the fiscal cliff, that one quite rightly, and by sexual scandals in the military and CIA. So much for their concentration. So going into Doha, what are the SIDS and the LDCs talking about? Urgency. Urgency has always been a mantra of the SIDS, remains a mantra of the SIDS, and will always be a mantra of the SIDS. One question I am asking myself is how much will COP18 in Doha be yet another exercise in frustration of the deaf and the blind? Not the deaf and the blind as to whether there is climate change, we're all agreed on that. Not the deaf and the blind as to whether what needs to be done, we are more or less agreed on that. But deaf and blind as to the urgency of the situation. So my message going into Doha is ambition, ambition, ambition. Ambition in emissions cuts. Ambition in ramping up mitigation between now and 2020. We don't want to wait to 2020. If we wait until 2020, some of us in the States will not be around at the rate we're going now. Ambition in the financing. Ambition in recently in New York, the heads of state and government of AOCs met. We have a leaders' declaration. We have 5 asks from Doha, the things we would like to see done. Ambition in everything that needs to be done, whilst on the side we discuss some issues that are being raised here, especially those issues raised by Monique, as to how appropriate is the process that we are engaged in now. But we do not want that to be a distraction. It has to be something that complements the discussions going on. So what we are pleading for, and we will always plead for, is urgency and ambition. And I can promise you one thing. In Doha, we are not going to let up under pressure. We are going to continue with the pressure. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, just to get into the discussion portion, I think the first question I'll ask my panelists is, can you, at this point, how do you justify the continued existence of the COPs? After all this frustration, what do you say to skeptics who might think that a more effective way of addressing this problem might be in smaller groups like the G20, or in perhaps a unilateral or bilateral action by major emitting countries? What role do these worldwide meetings still have to play in addressing this problem? And anyone here can jump in who has something to say. Olof?
Yeah, I think that smaller groups can be effective to a certain extent, but I also think it's a value in itself to have the whole world mobilized around this target and to meet this challenge, because the effects are global, which is obvious when we look into the effects. But I also believe that we need to work in many different contexts. Of course, what we are doing in the European Union is very, very important for for the European Union. Much complaining about the US, but let me then tell you that US has reduced their emissions with 550 tons during the last 5 years because of the shale gas revolution. And US is actually one of the best performers in class right now when they come to do it. So they can be quite proud actually. But that shows the impact of technology. They have gone from using coal to using natural gas instead.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I briefly mentioned this in my intervention earlier. The centrality of the convention is something which gives it a universal acceptance and legality. Because of the impact of climate change and because of the impact of global warming, silos would not work. They will supplement the main theme, the main work of the international community. But to fragment it further would perhaps be going backwards. What has been reaffirmed by the international community in Rio again is that acceptance of this principle of addressing this very important and critical issue through the legally acceptable framework of the convention, not only in climate but perhaps in other areas of sustainable development as well.
Merci. Moi, je crois qu'à travers les questions qui ont été soulevées et les débats, je crois que le problème est moins de savoir si on est optimiste ou pessimiste que d'être réaliste. Parce que souvent, dans ce genre de questions telles que les changements climatiques, un optimiste est souvent un pessimiste contraint. Et je rejoins le dernier orateur qui avait insisté aussi sur la notion de temps. Je crois que c'est fondamental, c'est capital. Jacques Chirac disait au sommet de Johannesburg en 2002 que la maison brûle et nous regardons ailleurs. Je crois que tous les rapports, qu'il s'agisse des rapports du GIEC, le rapport que j'ai signalé tout à l'heure, le rapport du Club de Rome, tous montrent que nous sommes sur la droite ligne d'une situation qui risque d'être irréversible à très court terme. Donc il y a urgence d'agir. Dans ce dialogue, on a souvent tendance à simplifier pour dire qu'il suffit d'avoir un certain nombre d'ambitions et que tout ira bien. Moi, je crois que tous les débats sont d'une extrême complexité. D'abord parce qu'il y a un problème de méthodologie, souvent en lieu et place des dialogues. Nous avons souvent une guerre de posture, des intérêts contradictoires, des intérêts opposés. Et dans ce contexte, il n'y a pas véritablement de dialogue. Il y a une forme d'affirmation de position des intérêts particuliers. Il y a également une forme de biais au niveau de la méthodologie. Souvent, on perd énormément de temps en opposant la situation des climato-sceptiques aux intégristes écologiques, c'est-à-dire de la conservation à tout va. Et je crois qu'entre les deux, il y a une situation qui nous permet probablement de prendre les faits pour ce qu'ils sont. La notion de temps ou de technologie ou les avancées, c'est évident. C'est évident qu'il y a des avancées importantes au niveau de la technologie. Mais le temps presse. Si vous parlez aux États insulaires, ça représente un peu plus d'une quarantaine de pays. C'est à peu près 300 millions d'habitants. Une élévation de 2 degrés, c'est une menace directe et à très court terme. Donc la notion de temps n'est pas la même pour ceux qui sont directement menacés et pour lesquels il y a urgence d'agir, et pour ceux qui peuvent essayer d'attendre que le marché fasse son effet ou que la technologie apporte un certain nombre de solutions. Prenons le débat de ce matin sur les énergies. Le rapport de l'Agence de l'énergie montrait que les États-Unis allaient se placer donc à très court terme donc devant l'Arabie saoudite comme producteur de pétrole. Nous voyons qu'il y a eu un effort important grâce, entre guillemets, à la technologie, c'est-à-dire la production de gaz et de pétrole à partir des schistes, avec la fracture hydraulique, c'est-à-dire utilisation de produits chimiques d'une façon importante et surtout recours à l'eau d'une façon démesurée. L'eau qui est une ressource rare et qui pose un véritable problème pour beaucoup de pays. À partir de là, on nous dit également dans ce même rapport que l'électricité en 2030, elle coûtera 40% plus cher dans les pays européens que dans les États-Unis. Quelle est, dans ce cas-là, la signification et le sens de la compétitivité dans les règles du commerce international? Quel est l'avenir de cette libéralisation du commerce au niveau de l'Organisation mondiale sur la compétitivité et l'ouverture des marchés lorsque les règles de base ne sont pas les mêmes, lorsque les normes écologiques ne sont pas les mêmes et lorsque les modes de développement ne sont pas les mêmes? Je crois que nous sommes devant de véritables problèmes. Dans le temps, il y avait l'ordre, donc tout était administré, tout était organisé de façon autoritaire. Nous sommes rentrés dans une phase où il y a une forme de désordre. Je reprends la phrase de Régis Debray qui disait que deux choses menacent le monde, l'ordre et le désordre. Je crois qu'entre l'ordre ancien et le désordre actuel, il va falloir trouver donc un système qui permet d'avoir cette responsabilité collective qui est importante. La responsabilité historique est un fait, mais je crois que c'est un débat qui est épuisé. Il est évident que la pollution actuelle est due aux pays développés, mais il est évident que les pays émergents, les pays en développement ont une responsabilité future. Donc il y a une responsabilité différenciée et la solidarité devant l'effort à accomplir est une solidarité qui doit être faite. Je crois que ça a été dit à travers le Fonds vert, qui doit donc avoir de nouveaux mécanismes qui permettent d'aller vers de nouveaux modes de développement. Mais il est important de dire qu'il y a urgence d'agir et je crois que nous avons une toute petite fenêtre pour agir immédiatement. Si à Doha on n'arrive pas à avoir un protocole intérimaire qui permet, peut-être sur 5 ans ou sur 7 ans selon les propositions, c'est-à-dire soit jusqu'à 2017 ou 2020, un protocole de Kyoto rénové qui prenne en charge justement toutes ces préoccupations actuelles, en attendant qu'en 2020, il y ait donc un protocole beaucoup plus substantiel avec des textes et des outils juridiquement contraignants et qui nous permettent d'avancer. On peut être pessimiste lorsqu'on voit qu'à Rio+20, même sur une déclaration, la déclaration de Rio n'engage pas, enfin c'est un engagement, mais ça n'est pas juridiquement contraignant. Même sur ce contrat donc universel, nous n'arrivons pas à avancer. Il y a des craintes à ce que le Doha, si ça n'est pas la dernière chance, que probablement nous rentrons dans une phase d'irréversibilité, d'une perturbation globale et qui nous met devant un effondrement qui est imminent.
I think my take is different. Will be in a sense that these COP or the large conferences, summits on environmental and climate issues are, I mean, nothing bad about it. But I think the real reason is how, nothing wrong with these conferences, but how we really aim to get the result out of it. It's not the focus on the end result is the real problem here, because we ignore the means. We ignore the means and we always focus on the end. The means are as important as ends are. I mean, in this sense, if you look at it, what kind of process we undertake to achieve results in these kind of big conferences. When we reach the big gatherings, there the aim is to how to pressurize, how to manipulate and find an agreement in the end. There is a lack of participation, lack of ownership for many partners, many countries, many stakeholders in the process. How to bring them together? How to get them their ownership into the process? Is there any proper consultation process going on, getting into their views, and which will reflect in the agreements which is taking place in the large conferences, or in these 2 weeks, the COP meetings which takes place, the first 10 days nothing happens, the last few days head of the states appears and others disappear, and then suddenly some final result comes out with an understanding. How far that represents the real interest, the real issues where the people are really asking for. I think that's what it's not exactly about the large conferences, but are we representing the interest and the demands of the different stakeholders in the process or not?
So to pivot a bit from that, all of you are veterans of quite a few of these conferences. I'm curious, over the years, what have you learned about what makes an effective COP meeting? You know, how going forward would you set this up, and what are some mistakes in the past that you could point to, and how these conferences are organized that could be avoided?
The way the process is nowadays, you have a COP, and usually until the next COP you have 2 meetings. The habit has been number 1 is always in Bonn, and then you end up somewhere else, either Bangkok or Panama City or whatever, and then you go into the next COP. The COP, unfortunately, I think is something we cannot do away with all its problems. It's because it's the only place where we're all represented. Everybody has a voice. The problem is it turns into a Tower of Babel. And at the worst, we scream at each other or scream over the heads or past each other. One thing we found, and one of the things we're going to change in the way the Alliance of Small Island States addresses the issues, AOSIS, is in between COPs there should be more consultations, not just in intersessional meetings, but meetings of groupings, especially groupings that disagree. Because we all have one thing in common. We all know where we're headed. We all know we want a new agreement. That we know we want a second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, which will be followed by a new agreement in 2015 to become effective in 2020. I'll give you something that happened in Bangkok, the last one we had. We met with BASIC. Now, within the G77 group, these are the 2 extremes. The Alliance of Small Island States, the smallest, and in terms of economic and political power, maybe amongst the weakest, certainly the loudest when it comes to making our voices heard. And at the other end, you have the emerging economies, the Chinas and Indias of this world. And the interesting thing that BASIC told us is next time this meeting should take place earlier in the pre-sessional. Instead of letting some of the negotiations go on and we start disagreeing, let us start at the beginning and put our positions on the table and say, where do we agree, where do we disagree? And it was interesting that it was the BASIC countries which asked AOSIS, can we meet early? So this time we've put in a request very early in Doha for the smallest of the groups, the AOSIS, to meet with BASIC to see where are we as we arrive in Doha. But before that, it is important. One of the reasons Cancun managed to salve a bit the wounds created in Copenhagen was because the Mexicans consulted throughout the year. They sent envoys around the world. They met with different groups, not the AOCs, LDCs, the ALBA groups, all the different groups that you have, and there's more and more groups forming now. And they consulted as the host to find out when we meet in Cancun, where can I expect there's going to be a stumbling block or a bottleneck, and how can we now agree to try and avoid that happening? So if we can have, and one of those groups, as Monique said, is G20. And I said this is important because I remember when we met in Dublin, and I am giving an anecdote, and AOSIS met with BASIC in Dublin, and BASIC obviously is part of G77. The BASIC group were very shocked when delegates from islands asked BASIC, who are we talking to? Are we talking to the emerging economies of G77, or are we talking to G20? Putting them in the group with the developed. Because we had become confused as to when they speak, who are they speaking for? Whose interests are they pushing forward? So you need more consultations. So I think it has to be a continuous dialogue, not jumping from one meeting to another at a time when climate change itself, the science is emerging more and more, it's becoming more and more complex. So you need people to continuously take stock as we go from one meeting into another. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree very much with the previous speaker. I believe very much the continuous process and good preparations for the meeting. I think that was probably the most problematic thing with Copenhagen, is that it was not very well placed in time, because the negotiators never have. They can't agree on things when there is a fundamental disagreement back home, and that will always be the reality in negotiations. So therefore you need to create the basic consensus in a process like the previous speaker talked about. But I would also like just a comment on one of the issues that was raised here about the fund. Of course, there is a need for financing, but one should be aware of the fact that developing countries today are very, very attractive as for investors. So I wouldn't say that the lack of capital is the big issue here. The big issue is the lack of human capital, the capacity in developing countries to utilize the new technologies and to implement new modes of production in everything from agriculture to industry. And to invest in human capital, to invest in education, to invest in research, to invest in spreading of technology, and to really utilize the new means of communications, to really utilize the ICT, to really take use of the internet in order to develop human capital globally, and to spread technology globally, and to spread technological know-how globally. I would say that is the crucial thing. And this is also very, very important with regard to timing. Because if time is essential, we will never be able to fight climate change top-down. We need to work with ordinary people, with ordinary businessmen, with ordinary farmers, with ordinary entrepreneurs that takes the responsibility for implementing the new solutions.
You brought up the fund before. Perhaps you'd like to respond to that?
Yes, but first I would like to put another perspective in the question you were asking about. Is the COP model the right one or not? I think the problem of this convention is very particular, is that it has been too much under the lights of the press and of many people in the world. I mean, it's very interesting to note that Marrakesh has come with a very good result, Kyoto has been a very good result, and that everything starting to get wrong inside the climate change negotiation at the time of Copenhagen, when it was supposed to be the head of states meeting. And I would like also to show that in other subjects, and if you take, for example, biodiversity convention inside the COP are achieving today great results. But it's not under the item that everybody is talking about. And so I have the impression that actually under the climate change, you have, I would say, professional negotiators in the COP who have thought and who are still thinking that they can hold up the negotiation because of the interest that everybody is showing into the subject of the climate change. And so that is why I'm saying that you have also to be negotiating outside of the COP today, not because I believe into partial agreement, but because I need that you need part of the negotiation which is not always being talked about through all type of media. It's very interesting to note that your meeting, well, actually you are taking the climate change again. Why don't you talk about the biodiversity convention, access and benefit sharing protocol, GMOs? They are issues which are maybe even more important, but it's not what is the interest of people today. And so by putting that type of pressure, the negotiation is wrong. There is all kind of pressure which happen into the places of those COP of climate change today, which have not too much to do with really the topics they should be dealing with. So, and the question of the funds is the same. Why is the money question being dealt before the commitments? This is just incomprehensible, because normally you should say, okay, here are the commitments we are ready to take, and they are going to cost that much, and they have to be implemented under such modalities, and then you will decide of whether it is a fund that you need, or whether it is other tools, how much money you are going to need, what kind of money you are going to need. It's not like that at all. It is negotiated. Because, once again, you have very professional negotiators in climate change today, which come with objectives which have very little to do today with what they are supposed to be doing.
Jamil, I think you wanted to weigh in on that?
Just briefly, thank you. I think I agree with Monique. There has to be some enabling action to make these negotiations a success. And when I say this, my mind goes to two things. One, interaction with civil society, and number two, interaction with scientific community. These are the two basic segments, important segments, which contribute to the realization of the objectives of the convention. On scientific community, IPCC is doing a very good role. They are helping it. But then our organization, Environment Program, has lately upgraded its profile in association with, in its collaboration with the climate change and the climate change community. The gap analysis report, which was produced by UNEP 2 years ago, helped the negotiators a lot in identifying targets, in identifying their, defining their positions. Lately, UNEP has now been upgraded to universal membership, and that will also help us to engage more on these issues, whether that is the science policy interaction, because most of these negotiators, as Monique says, are diplomats and policy makers. So their interaction with scientific community, their interaction with other international organizations who are dealing with these issues will help the negotiators. But of course, the structure of COP and the meetings is not cast in stone, and that also needs perhaps a review at an appropriate time.
All right, I think we'll see if there are any questions from the audience now.
Thank you very much. Regarding climate change, regarding how it impacts us, this is very important that we discuss it. It shows that we are evolving. It shows that everything that we do is evolving. The problem is that what I think is important to see this issue multidimensionally, and at the same time to treat it in complex matters, as you said, Your Excellency. And at the same time to see exactly what are the instruments that we use at national levels in order to influence what happens at international level. Because that international level also influences what we do at national level. And what I suggest, or also as a comment, is maybe to look inside ourselves within the national country so that we can see exactly what are the necessary steps in order to provide also the financial resources? Because as you well know, there are a lot of constraints, budgetary constraints at the national level. At the same time, what if we can put within the national budgets the align with investing in sustainable development? This does not happen at this moment. Why shouldn't we put it up to it? Why at the same time shouldn't we put in education in the national budgets this topic? Why at the same time we should transmit and transform our messages in a positive message so that investors would see how they can support better what we do at national level, and also transfer into legislation what we need in order to make this climate change much more closer to us so that we can understand it. so that we can change it from within, so that we can work within education, in the kindergartens, in the schools, in the high schools, in the universities, with programs. There are a lot of money in international environment in this sector. Let's bring it much more closer to our national levels. Because as you well know from the budget of the national, of the countries, we put it into international organizations. That means that money that we put there should at some point in time be a return on investment for the national states and for the people in those national states. In this sense, what I represent today is, my name is Răzvan Buzatu, I'm from Romania, and I represent TeamNet International Corporation. Now within this corporation, there is this position that is called knowledge.
I'm sorry, can you phrase this as a question?
No, it's not a question. It's just comment and that's it. Just.
All right. Well, I think we're going to move on because.
Yes. Okay.
Right.
Well, that's why. Thank you very much, and thank you for what you said.
All right. Well, actually, just going off of that, I'm curious. Have you seen any differences in, as the global financial crisis has affected the developed world, in the level of investment that countries are willing to put into mitigating climate change? How has the crisis changed the discussion for you? Ashok?
I mean, certainly it has, the focus has diverted quite a bit, or to a large extent, particularly when of course, the failure of Copenhagen was one of the reasons, but also it coincided with the economic crisis. The economic crisis, of course, it is extremely important for the countries and the politicians, those who are the political will is constrained by the economic crisis, and nobody should really ignore that fact. And that is where the shift took place. Of course, while doing that, we focused on the economic issues. We ignored a lot of issues, including climate change, the food issues, land issues. There are lots of water issues. Those were put into the back burner. I mean, this is where the real challenge took place. The economic crisis, of course, is a global in nature, but the economic crisis will come and go. But the climate change, which has been affecting, this is getting more and more serious. So we cannot just wait for the economy to go better. Then we'll think about it. And once we start think about it, then the economy also will go down, because we always try to spend more than what we really earn, and then again the crisis will come when we don't have anywhere to go.
Yeah, I think it works actually both ways, because one of the problems with the financial crisis is that the banks do not, or the demand for capital from the traditional business is much weaker than it used to be. And which means that there is lots of capital available for investments, and if you look at the global level of interest rates, of course it's very, very favorable right now to invest in long-term projects, because you can get very, very cheap credits. So on the global capital market. So I would say it works both ways. Let us also, I also think that we should not see this as a cost, basically. I mean, the investment in new green technology is basically very, very profitable. What we are doing in basic research with regard to solar cells now, for example, globally, will have a tremendous revenue in the future. And what we are doing with regard to energy efficiency will also have tremendous positive effects on our economies and on the standard of living. Not only with regard to environmental factors, but also with regard to pure welfare factor. It is not, I would say, it's not costly to invest in those areas. It's a question of being more efficient utilizing our natural resources, and that's basically a very, very profitable business. Actually, all profits globally, historically, has been made by companies that has been able to economize the utilization of natural resources. That's the idea of investments, more or less.
Ambassador Jumeau and then Commissioner.
Yes, if I can give an experience that we're having in Seychelles. When we engage with our bilateral and multilateral partners on issues of climate change. We do not have a separate development and climate change discussion. It's all part of the same discussion. As far as we're concerned, it's a development discussion. The Seychelles economy rests primarily on a marine-based tourism and an environmentally based tourism, which means climate change and environmental and biodiversity issues are central to that. And secondly, on tuna fishing. So when we talk to them, we incorporate the two together. And for example, what we've just launched in Seychelles last month, we had our first seminar. We're having a debt for adaptation swap to tackle our financial economic problems. We also had a big crisis in 2008. A debt for adaptation swap where we'll exchange debt for money to fund marine protected areas as ecosystem-based adaptation to climate change. The result was, when we had the seminar, that in the same room you had the Ministry of Finance and the Central Bank, obviously, also the Ministry of Environment, also the NGOs, the Association of Fishermen, the Tourism Association, the Chamber of Commerce, that is civil society, private sector, government, various people, all in the same room at the same time before we go and meet our development partners. We made it part and parcel of the development agenda. For us, climate change is about development. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. Thank you.
Juste en réaction à ce qui vient d'être dit, je pense qu'il y a un proverbe japonais qui dit: lorsque votre seul outil est un marteau, vous finirez par prendre tout pour un clou. La croissance, c'est évident. La croissance, c'est évident. Donc, il faut de la croissance. Mais de quelle croissance parle-t-on? Je crois que ce qui est en cause, c'est notre modèle de développement global. La croissance n'est pas le développement et le développement ne s'oppose pas à la croissance. Donc nous sommes devant une situation où nous sommes tenus de globaliser nos réflexions et je crois que toutes les conventions des Nations Unies, qu'il s'agisse de la lutte contre la désertification et principalement tout ce qui concerne les ressources naturelles, la dégradation des terres, des sols dans les pays pauvres, les phénomènes d'immigration, notamment l'immigration écologique, donc tous ces problèmes-là sont liés, la biodiversité pareil. Donc je pense que nous sommes devant la nécessité de globaliser la réflexion et entre le niveau national et le niveau international tel que cela a été souligné, je crois qu'il y a une très grande nécessité de voir quel modèle de développement nous voulons. Nous ne pouvons pas parler de la solidarité intergénérationnelle et de préserver les ressources naturelles pour le bien des générations futures lorsque nous ne sommes pas capables d'assurer une solidarité intragénérationnelle. Je crois que ça, c'est le problème fondamental et il me semble que le troisième pilier du développement durable est fondamental, celui des aspects sociaux, et cela probablement que le grand défi des années à venir va se poser. Donc il est utile de parler de l'eau et je crois que tous les climato-sceptiques en principe avancent un certain nombre d'échelles de priorité. Quand on voit les climato-sceptiques, ils ne se posent pas, ils reconnaissent que la croissance, que la température augmente, que les émissions de gaz à effet de serre donc, en sont responsables. Ils reconnaissent l'acidification des océans, ils reconnaissent pratiquement toutes les données scientifiques, mais le problème qui se pose, c'est une question de priorité. Comment nous allons agencer ce grand train pour essayer d'avancer vers les mêmes objectifs? Parce que j'ai donné tout à l'heure l'exemple des énergies. Il est illusoire de croire que demain, nous allons avoir une norme d'échanges internationaux ouverts sans avoir les mêmes règles de départ de la norme environnementale. Parce que demain, les pays qui importent sont devant trois cas. Soit ils ferment les frontières, soit ils mettent une taxe environnementale, soit ils abandonnent ce qu'ils font actuellement comme subvention ou comme investissement dans les énergies renouvelables. 40 milliards d'euros investis par l'Allemagne pour moins de 1% de la production d'énergie. Je crois qu'il y a un certain nombre de normes qu'il faut dégager pour essayer de voir quelles sont les priorités. Et le temps presse. Il faut le rappeler, le temps presse. Il est urgent de trouver une norme qui permet, à travers des textes juridiquement contraignants, d'avancer dans le même sens pour les mêmes objectifs.
One question from the front here. Okay.
Jawad Kardoudi, je suis président de l'Institut marocain des relations internationales et je voudrais d'abord partager l'avis de ceux qui sont pessimistes. Moi-même, je suis pessimiste. Je pense qu'il n'y a pas eu suffisamment de progrès concernant le changement climatique parce que les pays développés ont une grave crise économique et donc ils ne pensent plus à cela. Et les pays émergents veulent rattraper leur retard par rapport aux pays. Donc ça, c'était le premier point. Alors je voudrais, Madame Barbut a parlé des institutions. Pourquoi ne pas penser à une organisation mondiale de l'environnement, comme à l'instar de l'OMC? Moi, je considère que les problèmes de l'environnement sont aussi importants que les problèmes des échanges commerciaux. Donc, pourquoi ne pas militer pour une telle organisation? Monsieur Swain des Seychelles, pourquoi les pays directement concernés ne forment pas un groupe? Parce que c'est vous qui, finalement, sont les plus menacés par le changement climatique. Et je pense qu'il serait intéressant à ce que vous fassiez un groupe pour essayer de défendre le plus possible votre position. Et enfin, le rôle de la société civile, je crois que c'est très important. Et personne n'a parlé des partis écologiques, des partis politiques. Je pense que c'est important que dans chaque pays, il y ait des partis écologiques qui défendent justement ces thèmes et qui puissent remonter, comme a dit monsieur le représentant de Suède, partir de la base vers le sommet et non pas du sommet vers la base. Et je vous remercie.
All right, several questions there. Does anyone want to jump in first? Sir Jumeau?
Yes, first of all the small islands, we already form part of the Alliance of Small Island States, which is one of the groups that you cannot ignore in climate negotiations. But further than that, for several COPs now, there has been an alliance between the small island developing states in AOSIS and the LDCs, the least developed countries. The alliance was enlarged to include Africa, but every now and then we have some differences, divergences with Africa as a continent. But when the three come together, as you can see, that's a large number of countries, and especially those are all the most vulnerable. So we're more into alliances, common positions in the negotiations, finding what we can push together. And this is something that the small island states we've vowed to do coming into Doha, is to go into more alliances, even in groups that sometimes we have very divergent views on key issues, but trying to better understand where people are coming from. That's one of the key to negotiations, is better understanding your adversary and why they take the positions, and to try and show that your position is not a threat to whatever their interests are. So the issue of alliances within the talks is emerging more and more, and we're finding that these alliances are now moving out of the climate change sphere. For example, in issues of sustainable development, where we have the same challenges. This is what I'm talking about. The discussion between development and climate change is more and more becoming the same discussion. And here I would like to thank Monique, who during her time in JEF, because the JEF has provided Seychelles with a lot of financing to help mainstream climate change into development planning, into the whole development argument, and including money that's going to the civil society, money that's going to NGOs, not just to government, to make sure that they are part of and contribute to the national discussion. That's the issue that you raised. For your information, in Seychelles, environment and climate change is already in the school curriculum. When you go to school, you learn about it from kindergarten. And what also we have in Seychelles is that each primary and secondary school has a wildlife club which does after-hour activities on environment, biodiversity. They adopt beaches, for example. They have measure for the children to understand what is at stake, and they take this home to help explain it to parents, so that in the end you have a whole society, a whole nation talking about it. And if you come to Seychelles, for example, you stop anybody on the street, you will find that they are very much aware of what is happening. And that is what gives us, people like me, the mandate to speak the way I'm speaking. I'm not just representing what my government says. As an ex-minister of environment as well, I know exactly what people on the street are thinking. So it gives us the strength to take the position, sometimes unpopular with other countries, in the climate change debate. But as I said, it is no longer a climate change debate. It is a development debate. President Obama just said, don't think we're going to ignore economy and jobs to concentrate on climate change. He's made a mistake there. We're not asking him to ignore economy and jobs to concentrate on climate change. We are asking him, in tackling climate change, how can you contribute to the discussion on economy and jobs? When you're tackling economy and jobs, how can you do it in a way that does not affect climate change, that does not make climate change worse? We're saying we must bring the two conversations together. And when we were going into Rio, to go back to the first part of our question, Rio+20, when Alliance of Small Island States met in New York, we got a lot of opposition in bringing climate language into Rio. We had a huge problem in fact, we had a problem with climate change and oceans, bringing it into Rio. And that's why I said eventually, and Monique was right, with other undercurrents working in Rio, where you had a much bigger inclusiveness of the civil society, of NGOs, of youth especially, that people heard that there was a groundswell of opinion there, which politicians always listen to because it's all about votes eventually for them, that you had a better result coming out of Rio+20. So I think it's a question of climate change cannot be discussed in a vacuum. G20, when they talk about finance, they're talking about climate change as well. You cannot talk about energy anymore. You cannot talk about petroleum. You cannot talk about health even now without talking about climate change. You cannot even talk about gender nowadays without talking of climate change. There are special activities in Doha on that issue. Thank you.
So I think we had Jamil and Olof, and then I think we have to wrap it up.
Thank you. I will be brief because there was a question about World Environment Organization, and that is a discussion which was with us in the UNEP organization for a long time under the rubric of international environmental governance. Yes, there was this discussion, and it went all the way to Rio 5 months ago. And there are advocates for it, and there are people who think that it will not be helpful. The main discussion revolves around the mainstreaming of the activities of the multilateral environmental agreements, which, as I said earlier, are more than 500, how to bring environment under one umbrella. So at the moment, the international community found that they can do, for the time being, with strengthening and upgrading the United Nations Environment Program by giving it a more stronger mandate in terms of its robust activity and engagement with civil society, in terms of its grant of its universal membership, strengthening its science and policy interface, and also looking again at the very structure of the organization of how to interact on this important issue. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's on the analytical level and on as well as on a very concrete level, it's very, very important to stress and to underline that there is a strong link between climate change and development. One of the wonderful things with investments in new green technology is that developing countries can leapfrog into the newest and most modern technologies. And ICT is an excellent example of this. With the help of ICT, I mean, Kenya today has a more advanced cell phone payment system on ICT, cell phone banking, than Sweden, for example. And 70% of the bank transactions in Kenya is done by cell phones or via cell phones. And wherever you go in the developing world, you can see that the impact of ICT in solutions and business climate, etc. And that is a very, very good example of how you leapfrog into the most modern and most high-tech globally. And you also can see that this is emerging in healthcare. We are today, it is perfectly possible today to have telesurgery from US to Africa, for example. There is a project going on in India with telemedicine with East Africa, which is also shows the potential here. And when this is multiplied in the green tech, it's obvious that a key factor behind fighting climate change is not only technology development in the richer countries and the developed world, it's the spread of technology globally. And for exactly these reasons, it's so important that the developing world do not cut themselves off from the free flow of information through the internet and through the information technology systems. Because that is a tendency that certain countries do. But if you cut off the free flow of information, you also undermine your own capacity to build the human capital that will always be needed locally in order to develop the new climate smart solutions. So there is a very, very strong link between being connected to the global community, looking on these issues from a development perspective, and see to the benefits when you leapfrog into new technologies.
All right, I'd love to keep the conversation going, but I think seems like we're heading up into lunchtime. Sorry for people who didn't get to ask questions, but I'm sure you can continue the conversation over lunch. I want to thank all my panelists for a great discussion, and thank the MEDays Institute for having us. And thank you to all of you. Bye.